Somewhere in the oldest layers of recorded human memory there is a story so quiet it almost slips past you. A plane, a gathering of people, and a single, shared language stretching across the whole known world. No confusion, no misunderstanding, no stranger whose words you cannot follow. Just one tongue moving through one people building toward one sky. That's where Genesis 11 begins. And if you sit with it long enough, the strangeness of it starts to settle in like cold air through a window you forgot to close. We are so accustomed to a world of thousands of languages, to the ordinary miracle of translation, to the way meaning shifts and bends as it crosses borders, that we rarely stop to ask what it would actually feel like to live in a world without that friction. A world where every voice around you was already, effortlessly, yours. The book of Genesis imagines that world, and then, in the space of a few verses, it imagines what happened when something very old and very powerful decided that world could not be allowed to continue. That tension between unity and fragmentation, between the dream of one voice and the reality of many, is what this story is really about. And it is a tension that did not begin with the Bible. It runs through the ruins of Mesopotamia, through the administrative records of ancient empires, through clay tablets pressed with the wedge marks of scribes, who understood, perhaps better than anyone, what language could build and what it could destroy. Tonight we're going to move slowly through that world. We will read Genesis 11 the way it deserves to be read, not as a children's story about a failed construction project, but as a civilizational memory encoded in text. We will look at what a ziggurat actually was, what it meant to the people who built it and the people who feared it. We will walk through Babylon not as myth, but as a real city with a real skyline and a very real appetite for control. We will look at how ancient empires thought about language, how they used it, standardized it, feared its diversity, and tried to contain it. And we will look at the strange mercy hidden inside the story's ending, the idea that scattering might have been a gift dressed as a punishment. None of this is settled history. The ancient world does not offer a certainty, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What it offers instead is texture, suggestion, the feeling of standing at the edge of something enormous and only half lit. That is exactly where we want to be tonight. But let us start with the central question, because it is the one that gives this whole story its weight. Why would one language feel powerful, and why, in the same breath, would it feel dangerous? Think about that for a moment. Language is not just communication, it is coordination. It is the invisible architecture that lets large groups of people move as a single body, build things no individual could build, enforce rules that no single enforcer could maintain. When everyone speaks the same language, the friction of misunderstanding dissolves, plans travel faster, authority becomes easier to project. A command given at the center of an empire can reach its edges without distortion. That is enormous power. Civilizations have understood this for as long as there have been civilizations. But here is the other side of it. A language shared by everyone is also a language controlled by someone. When speech is unified, it can be monitored, standardized, redirected. The stories people tell about themselves, the gods they invoke, the grievances they name, all of it flows through a single channel. And whoever controls that channel controls something deeper than roads or walls or armies. They control the way reality is described, the way the world is spoken into being every single morning. That is what made one language feel both like a dream and like a threat, depending on where you were standing. For the builders on the plain, it was the condition of possibility. For whatever was watching from above, it was the sign of something that needed to be interrupted. We will not resolve that tension tonight, and we probably should not try. These are questions that the ancient world asked without expecting clean answers. What we can do is look at the world that produced this story. The mud brick cities of Mesopotamia rising from flat river valleys, the towers that scrape toward the sky, not out of arrogance but out of theology, the empires that spent enormous energy trying to make everyone speak the same way, and found again and again that the world resisted. We will look at what later readers made of this story, how it was interpreted and reinterpreted across centuries, each generation finding in it whatever their moment needed it to mean. There is something almost dreamlike about the way Genesis 11 opens. The earth had one language and the same words. That is the whole setup. No explanation of how it came to be, no description of what that language sounded like, no sense of how long it had existed. It is simply the condition of the world, the way gravity is a condition of the world, unremarkable until the moment it becomes the thing everything else depends on. And then, almost immediately, people are moving, settling, building, as if language and construction are the same impulse, as if to speak together is already to begin building together. That is not an accident of narrative. That is the story knowing exactly what it is doing. Over the next little while, we're going to follow that thread from the plain of Shinar all the way through to the long shadow Babylon cast over the ancient imagination and beyond. We will take our time. There is no rush tonight. The questions are old enough that a few more minutes will not change anything, and the answers, such as they are worth approaching slowly, the way you approach something in the dark that you want to understand rather than startle. If you're listening to this right now, I would love to know where you are. Drop a comment and tell me what time it is and what part of the world you're in. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that this story, which is itself a story about scattered voices finding their way to meaning, is being heard in a dozen different time zones at once. Someone in the middle of a rainy night in one city, someone just waking up somewhere else, someone on a train between places they cannot name in the dark. All of you, sitting with the same ancient mystery, in the same language, at different hours. That is, in its own small way, exactly what this story's about. So, settle in. Let the night be quiet around you. We're going to read Genesis 11 slowly, the way it was always meant to be read, and see what the plain of Shinar looks like when we really let ourselves look. Genesis 11 is one of the shortest significant passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. You can read it in about 2 minutes, and yet people have been sitting with it for thousands of years, which is usually a sign that something in it is doing more work than its length suggests. Let us actually walk through it, not summarize it. Walk through it. It opens with a condition. The whole earth had one language and the same words. Then it describes movement. People journeyed from the east, or possibly toward the east. The direction is actually slightly ambiguous in the original, and they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. That is the first beat. Migration. A people moving and finding a place. Then comes building. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. This is the second beat. Technology. The text is oddly specific here, and that specificity matters. Brick for stone, bitumen for mortar. These are the materials of Mesopotamia, a flat river valley with no natural stone and abundant clay. Whoever shaped this story knew something about that landscape, or was describing something they recognized as belonging to it. Then comes the plan. Let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And here is the part that people often rush past. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. That is the third beat, motive. And it is worth holding for a moment, because the text does not describe villains here. It describes people who are afraid. They want a name. They want to stay together. They want something permanent in a world that feels unstable. These are not alien impulses. Then the divine response. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower. Came down. This is the fourth beat. and it carries a quiet irony that the text seems entirely aware of. The tower they built to reach heaven is so small that the divine perspective has to descend just to examine it, and the response is not anger exactly. It reads more like concern, or perhaps something closer to recognition. Behold, they are one people, and they have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Then the action. Come, let us go down, and they confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. Fifth beat, intervention, and notice the echo. The human said, "Come, let us build." The divine voice says, "Come, let us go down." The structure is mirrored deliberately. Whatever is responding to this project is doing so in exactly the register the builders used, then scattering. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city, and finally naming. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. 6 movements: migration, construction, motive, descent, confusion, scattering. It is a very clean narrative architecture for something that contains this much ambiguity inside it. Now let us talk about the language of the text itself, not in an overly technical way, but enough to feel what it is doing. The Hebrew word for lip, which is one of the words used to mean language here, is sapha. The word for name is shem. The word for scatter is putz. These 3 concepts circle each other through the entire passage, and they circle each other because they are, in this story, genuinely related. To share a language is to share a way of naming. To lose language is to lose the ability to build a shared name, a reputation, a legacy, a city. And the scattering that the builders feared is precisely what the confusion of the language produces. The thing they tried to prevent becomes the consequence of trying to prevent it. There is a kind of tragic precision in that structure, and it feels intentional. The story is built to make you feel the irony without having to announce it. Now, what kind of story is this? That question matters because different kinds of stories make different kinds of claims. One possibility is that this is an etiological story, which is a story that explains how something came to be. Why are there so many languages in the world? Because of what happened at Babel. Why do human projects sometimes reach a certain height and then fall apart? Same reason. Etiological stories are not necessarily claims about literal historical events. They're explanations of conditions. They answer the question, why does the world look this way, by telling a story that carries the logic of it. Another possibility is that this is theological narrative, a story that is trying to say something true about the relationship between human ambition and divine attention. Not a chronicle, but a meditation. The kind of truth that does not depend on whether the specific tower existed, because the tower is serving as a figure for something that keeps happening. A third possibility is cultural memory, a story that encodes something a people experienced or observed, perhaps the sight of a massive Babylonian ziggurat, perhaps the reality of imperial language standardization, perhaps the felt experience of exile and displacement, and shaped it into narrative so it could be carried forward. Not invented from nothing, but crystallized from something real and given lasting form. These possibilities are not mutually exclusive. Stories can be all of these things at once, and the oldest ones often are. What the text claims clearly is this: a unified language enabled unified action. The divine response was to interrupt that unity through linguistic confusion. The result was dispersal across the earth. The text names this place Babel. What the text leaves beautifully, perhaps deliberately ambiguous, whether the project was wrong in itself or only in its scale. Whether the scattering was punishment or prudence or something the story itself is not sure how to categorize. Whether the people on the plain were naive or simply human in the most recognizable way possible. wanting to build something that lasts and being afraid of disappearing into the wide, indifferent earth. The passage does not resolve those questions. It just holds them, the way a plane holds the ruins of a tower that was never finished. If you hear tower with its top in the heavens, it is very easy to picture the wrong building. Many of us instinctively imagine something like a medieval spire or a skyscraper, or maybe an Egyptian pyramid. But the world that Genesis 11 seems to be gesturing toward did not build pyramids, it built ziggurats. So what is a ziggurat? Imagine a series of stacked platforms, each one smaller than the one below, rising in a kind of giant terraced staircase. The core is not solid stone like the pyramids of Giza. It is mud brick, sun-baked clay held together with bitumen and plaster. The whole structure is more like an artificial mountain than a pure geometric shape. Instead of smooth sides running up to a point, you have receding stages, ramps, and stairways that climb from one level to the next. Egyptian pyramids were primarily tombs, designed to hold a dead king and everything he needed for the afterlife. Ziggurats were not tombs. As far as we can tell, no one was buried inside them. They were temple towers. Their purpose was not to house the dead, but to host the presence of the divine. If you stood in a major Mesopotamian city at its height, the ziggurat would have dominated the skyline. Not alone, but as the centerpiece of a temple complex. Courtyards, storage rooms, kitchens for preparing offerings, living quarters for priests and temple personnel, scribal rooms where accounts were recorded. The ziggurat rose out of this cluster of sacred and administrative buildings like the trunk of a tree rising from its roots. The very top, at least in later periods when we have better evidence, was thought to hold a shrine or small chapel, not a huge public space, but a relatively modest room where the statue of the god could be placed, or where the god was symbolically thought to rest. Most people in the city would never enter that upper shrine. Their relationship to the ziggurat was more indirect, mediated through rituals, festivals, and the ongoing life of the temple. Because the ziggurat was not just an isolated object, it sat inside a living system. Temples in Mesopotamian cities were economic as well as religious institutions. They owned land. They received offerings of grain, oil, animals, textiles. They redistributed food and goods to priests, workers, and sometimes to the needy. They stored surplus harvests. They kept detailed written records of all of this on clay tablets. If you wanted to find literacy in early Mesopotamia, the temple complex was one of the first places you would look. The ziggurat towering above was like the visual anchor of all that activity. Processions would move through the city streets on festival days, carrying statues of the gods, musicians playing, people following and watching. The path of those processions often led to or from the temple precinct, with the ziggurat looming overhead, a constant reminder that all this movement and sound was happening in the shadow of something meant to touch the sky. That height mattered symbolically. Mesopotamia is a river plain. It does not have many natural mountains. So if you wanted a place where heaven and earth seemed to meet, you had to build it yourself. Across cultures, high places have often been imagined as closer to the divine. In the ancient Near East, gods are frequently described as dwelling on mountains, sitting on elevated thrones, ruling from the heights. A ziggurat was a way of importing that imagery into a flat landscape. It made a vertical axis where there had only been horizontal spread. Some scholars use the phrase stairway between heaven and earth to describe what a ziggurat represented in local imagination. That does not mean people believed gods literally walked up and down the steps like commuters. It means that for the inhabitants of these cities, the ziggurat marked a point of contact, a focus where prayers, offerings, and divine favour could symbolically move between realms. In Sumerian and Akkadian texts, ziggurats are sometimes described with phrases that sound very much like Genesis 11's top in the heavens. One Babylonian name for a tower later on is often translated Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. These are not engineering specifications, they are metaphors. The language is liturgical, poetic, aspirational. It is trying to say, this is the place where our city touches the divine order. To get a structure like that into the air, especially in a wet river valley, required relentless work. Stone was rare in southern Mesopotamia. Wood of good quality was rare. What they had in almost obscene abundance was mud. So they became masters of brick. Clay was dug from riverbanks, mixed with straw, shaped into bricks, left to dry in the sun, sometimes fired in kilns, thousands upon thousands of bricks, tens of thousands, in some cases millions, each one made by hand, carried by hand, laid by hand, bound with bitumen or clay mortar. In some royal inscriptions, kings boast about the number of bricks they produced for a single temple project, as if the sheer volume of mud turned into architecture was itself an offering. But mud brick does not age gracefully. It erodes in rain, it slumps, it cracks. A ziggurat was not something you built once and walked away from. It demanded constant maintenance. New facing bricks, fresh plaster, periodic rebuilding of whole sections. When you see drawings of ziggurats with clean, sharp lines, it is worth remembering that the lived reality was probably messier. Scaffolding, workers, repairs, surfaces being patched and replastered as the years went by. This meant labour organisation on a large scale. Someone had to coordinate the brickmakers, the carriers, the builders. Someone had to feed them, schedule them, oversee the storage of raw materials. Temple complexes kept lists of rations, work assignments, deliveries. The tower in the centre of the city was bound up with a network of scribes, supervisors and workers whose days were spent making sure mud turned into height. When Genesis says, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly," it is not just giving us a charming construction detail. It is invoking a whole world of logistics, administration, and shared effort. To say, let us build a city and a tower in that environment is to say, let us commit ourselves to an ongoing project that will organize our labor, our festivals, our economy, our imagination around this rising structure. So when the builders on the plain of Shinar say they want a tower with its top in the heavens, it is unlikely that the text is picturing a literal attempt to pierce the sky, like a primitive space program. The phrase fits comfortably into the symbolic vocabulary of the region. It is the language of temple hymns and royal inscriptions, not of technical blueprints. What the story seems to be playing with is not the physics of altitude, but the psychology of it. The desire to create a place so elevated, so central, that it anchors identity itself. A city that thinks of its tower as the point where its name reaches upward, where its collective life connects to something more than human. In that sense, the ziggurat is not just a backdrop for the Tower of Babel story. It is almost a character in it. A human-made mountain, made of perishable mud, claiming in words and rituals to brush the edges of heaven. And it is around that kind of structure, and what it meant to live in its shadow, that the fears of scattering and the dreams of one language begin to make a particular kind of sense. When later readers of Genesis heard the word Babel, they were not thinking of a random town with a quirky building. They were hearing an echo of one of the most famous cities in their world, Babylon. Historically, Babylon rose to prominence in the 2nd millennium BCE, flourished under kings like Hammurabi, declined, then surged again under the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, the time of Nebuchadnezzar II, the exile of Judean elites, and the famous city walls that Greek writers would later describe, with a mix of awe and exaggeration. It was not always the greatest city on earth, but for long stretches it was one of the names you used when you wanted to talk about power. But Babylon's importance was not just military or economic, it was cultural. For centuries, Babylon was a center of scribal education. Sumerian and Akkadian literature was copied there, catalogued there, re-edited and re-performed. Astronomers watched the sky from its rooftops. Temple rituals were refined in its sanctuaries. Even when other cities had bigger armies, Babylon often had more prestige. To learn to read and write in much of the ancient Near East was, sooner or later, to come into contact with Babylonian ways of thinking. This means that when biblical writers chose a city as the stage for a story about language, unity, and a tower touching heaven, Babylon was an obvious candidate. Not necessarily because they had an exact blueprint of one particular construction project in mind, but because Babylon had become shorthand for a whole package of ideas: monumental architecture, imperial ambition, scribal culture, and gods enthroned above man-made heights. At the same time, we have to be careful. The text of Genesis 11 actually uses the name Babel, not Babylon. In Hebrew, Babel can refer to the historical city, but it also invites a pun on a Hebrew root that sounds like it means to confuse or to mix. The story leans into this wordplay. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. In Akkadian, the language of the region where Babylon stood, the city's name was something like Babilu, often glossed by later scribes as Gate of the God or Gate of the Gods. So on one side you have a proud local etymology. This is the gate where the divine world and the human world meet. On the other, a Hebrew storytelling etymology. This is the place of confusion and scattering. We should not imagine a committee of linguists sitting down to decide whose dictionary entry is correct. These are different communities taking the same syllables and building meaning around them in different ways. For the people who composed and preserved Genesis 11, Babel was already layered with associations. It evoked the imperial power that had eventually conquered Judah, destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and taken exiles away from their land. It evoked massive building projects carried out by forced labour. It evoked a city whose gods sat enthroned above towering structures of sun-dried brick. But Genesis is not a travel guide. It is dealing in memory, symbol, and critique, rather than in architectural blueprints. Babylon, as historians reconstruct it, was not a one-time instant city. It grew, fell, was rebuilt, modified, reimagined by different dynasties. Its famous ziggurat, which later sources call Etemenanki, house of the foundation of heaven and earth, seems to have gone through cycles of ruin and restoration. It was not a single moment of let us build now or never, but a recurring imperial project, reclaiming, repairing, and amplifying a sacred landmark to match each era's ambitions. So when Genesis compresses all of that into a single, compact narrative, they said, let us build us a city and a tower, it is doing what stories often do with long, messy histories. It distills. Instead of giving us lists of kings and construction phases, it gives us a scene. Humanity in one place, with one language, deciding as a collective to build something that will make their name great and prevent their scattering. Instead of naming Etemenanki or specifying Nebuchadnezzar, it uses the more ambiguous Babel, allowing the story to resonate with multiple layers of memory at once. From a purely historical angle, this can be frustrating. We might want to know, is Genesis 11 talking about Old Babylon, Hammurabi's city? Neo-Babylon, the city of the exile, some earlier Sumerian prototype? The text does not say, it does not pin itself down, but that looseness is part of what gives the story its power. Babylon, by the time Genesis was being shaped and reshaped, was not just a dot on a map. It was a symbol. It represented the height of human empire, the place where kings claimed to unite many peoples under one administration, one system of law, one state cult. Kings boasted in inscriptions about making the peoples of the four quarters speak with one voice under their rule. They bragged about rebuilding temple towers whose tops reached the heavens. In that light, Babel is a perfect setting for a narrative about unity gone wrong. It is the city that wants to be the axis of the world, the place where diverse peoples are gathered and reorganized under a single banner. If you are telling a story from the perspective of a small people who have experienced conquest, exile, and the pressure of imperial homogenization, Babylon is not just impressive, it is dangerous. So the story remembers Babylon and also warns through Babylon. It does not deny that humans can cooperate on a grand scale, or that they can build structures that dominate the landscape. It does not claim that such projects are impossible. Instead, it asks a different question. What happens when that scale of cooperation is bent towards self-protection, reputation, and fear of dispersal? What happens when one language becomes less about mutual understanding and more about control? From that angle, Babel is less a historical footnote and more a mirror. For the ancient audience, the name would have pulled in all kinds of impressions: towering walls, massive gates, processions, scribes scratching cuneiform onto tablets, foreign tongues in the marketplace, the hum of administrative orders passing down from palace to work crews. They might not know exactly when a particular ziggurat was restored, or which king inscribed which boast, but they knew what Babylon felt like as an idea, a machine for centralizing power and defining reality from the top of a tower downward. Stories are very good at preserving those kinds of impressions, even when details blur. Over generations, people misremember dates. They conflate kings. They move events up and down the timeline. But they remember the emotional weight of a place. Egypt becomes the land of slavery and deliverance. Babylon becomes the land of exile and proud towers. The outlines stay sharp even as the lines inside get smudged. So when we hear Babel in Genesis 11, we are hearing a city twice over. Babylon as historians try to reconstruct it from bricks and tablets, and Babylon as it lived in the cultural memory of those who told and retold the story. A real city, yes, with real walls and real workers hauling bricks in the heat. And also a symbolic city, compacted into a parable about what happens when a human project tries to rise high enough to make scattering impossible. Between those two Babylons, historical and remembered, the story of the tower finds its footing. It turns an empire's proud gate of the gods into a place named, in Hebrew imagination, for confusion. It takes the city that wanted to be the single point of connection between heaven and earth, and recasts it as a warning about trying to make one language and one name carry more weight than they were ever meant to bear. If Babylon is the stage for the story, Etemenanki is the piece of scenery that dominates the backdrop, even when the text never says its name. Later Babylonian lists and inscriptions call it Etemenanki, usually translated as House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. It was the city's great ziggurat, the stepped temple tower of the high god Marduk, rising above the temple complex that Greek writers would later call the Asagala. We do not have a photograph of it. We do not have an intact structure, only foundations, scattered bricks, later reconstructions, and texts that talk about it from different periods with different agendas. But taken together, they sketch the outline of something that, in its heyday, must have defined the skyline of Babylon just as surely as any modern skyscraper defines its city. The basic plan was the familiar ziggurat form, a massive solid core of mud brick coated with fired bricks, stepped up in receding terraces, probably with a shrine or chapel at the top. Unlike a pyramid, which narrows to a point, a ziggurat is like a stack of giant platforms, each one smaller than the one beneath. To reach the summit, you climb ramps or stairways that take you past each level, up toward the tiny house of the god that crowns the whole. How big was Etemenanki? Here we step into a fog of numbers, estimates, and scholarly debate. A famous text known as the Exile tablet, probably from the Hellenistic period, gives measurements that, if taken literally, would make the tower about 90 metres on a side and about 90 metres high, roughly a square base the size of several city blocks, rising as tall as a modern 30-storey building. Some scholars think this text idealizes or regularizes the dimensions, turning Etemenanki into a kind of perfect cosmic cube, a conceptual model more than an engineer's drawing. Others see the numbers as roughly plausible, perhaps slightly rounded, but in line with what a large Mesopotamian state could actually build and maintain. Archaeology adds new constraints. Excavators have uncovered parts of a huge mud brick foundation in Babylon that seems to fit the expected location and footprint of the ziggurat. The remains are eroded, robbed for later construction, and disturbed by centuries of flooding and rebuilding. But they are massive. Even if we shave off generous margins from the literary figures, we are still dealing with a tower that was big enough to require a workforce of thousands to build and a constant stream of labour to repair. We also need to remember that Etemenanki was not a single, frozen design stamped into the earth once and for all. Like the city itself, the ziggurat had a biography. Earlier Sumerian cities like Ur and Uruk already had temple towers. Some of these may have served as models, or at least as older cousins for Babylon's ziggurat. Babylon very likely had some form of Marduk temple complex with a raised platform long before the structure that later texts call Etemenanki reached its famous form. Then came centuries of conflict. Babylon was captured, damaged, neglected, rebuilt. Kings like Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar II of the Neo-Babylonian period boast in their inscriptions of finding the old ziggurat in a state of ruin and restoring it according to its ancient plan. This is a standard royal motif, the pious king who honours the distant past by rebuilding a sacred monument exactly as it was meant to be, or even bigger and better. From a historian's perspective, that phrase, according to its ancient plan, is almost certainly doing double duty. It claims continuity with antiquity, but it also allows each dynasty to project its own vision onto the past. A king stands before a mound of collapsed bricks, half-erased walls, foundation lines faintly visible under the dust. There is no complete blueprint. There are hints, perhaps older foundation deposits, maybe an earlier inscription. There is also the king's sense of what a proper cosmic tower should look like in his time. The new Etemenanki that rises out of those ruins is as much a monument to current power as it is a restoration of something old. The cycle repeats: build, decay, rebuild. Each phase leaves its traces in brick stamps and foundation texts. One king says he raised the tower to its proper height after impious predecessors let it crumble. Another claims he strengthened the foundations that an earlier restorer had not laid deep enough. By the time foreign conquerors arrive, Persian, then Macedonian, Etemenanki has already passed through several lives. Greek and later sources muddy the waters further. Herodotus, if he visited the city at all, does not give a clear, reliable description of the ziggurat itself. Other Greek writers, like Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek, report older traditions, but filter them through Hellenistic perspectives. They might exaggerate dimensions or simplify complexities for audiences far from Mesopotamia. One later story says Alexander the Great ordered the ruined tower demolished, intending to rebuild it, only to die before he could begin. Whether or not that detail is precise, it captures the sense that by the late 4th century BCE, Etemenanki was again a massive, decaying symbol that invited grand but unfinished plans. So when we speak of Etemenanki, we are not looking at one thing. We are looking at a palimpsest, layers of construction, each tied to different kings, different political agendas, and different ideas about what a cosmic mountain ought to be. What all those layers share is their role in legitimizing rule. In Mesopotamia, kings did not just claim to be strong or clever. They claimed to be the ones who restored order between heaven and earth. Rebuilding a major ziggurat was not just a public works project. It was a theological statement. When a king says, "I raised its head to the sky," or "I made its top rival the heavens," he is presenting himself as the one who reconnects the community with the divine realm. The labourers hauling bricks, the craftsmen firing tiles glazed in deep blues and golds, the scribes recording deliveries of bitumen and timber, all of them are, in royal rhetoric, participating in the king's pious work of cosmic maintenance. The tower becomes a vertical axis of legitimacy. At the base, the city, its markets, its households. At the top, the god's dwelling. In between, the king, the administrator of the connection. In that sense, Etemenanki was more than a religious monument. It was imperial propaganda cast in mud brick. Imagine approaching Babylon along one of its processional roads. As you come closer, the walls thicken, the gates loom, and above everything else, a stepped mass rises, layered and angular against the flat horizon of the plain. That shape tells you something, even if you cannot read a single cuneiform sign. It says, "This is the place where the god's house touches the sky. This is the city at the centre. This is the king who commands the labour and resources to pile earth into a mountain and clad it with fired brick." For the inhabitants, that skyline could be a source of pride. To belong to Babylon was to live in the shadow of the tower, whose name called heaven and earth together. Hymns praise the city as a navel of the world, a gathering place of gods and nations. Processions moved from temple to tower along carefully planned routes, binding the city's ground-level spaces to its elevated holy places. For outsiders, especially those who came as captives or deportees, the same skyline could feel very different. The tower might not just signify divine presence, it might embody the power that had uprooted them, the machinery of a state that could standardize weights and measures, calendar and laws, under the watchful gaze of a god enthroned above them all. Somewhere in that tangle of pride and resentment, astonishment and unease, memories form. By the time Israelite and Judean communities were telling and retelling stories in and about Babylon, Etemenanki was part of the city's public face. Exiles and travellers would have seen it, heard about its restorations, listened to locals recount how this king or that one had brought it back from ruin. Scribes among them might have read or at least heard lines from Babylonian inscriptions celebrating the tower whose top reached heaven. We cannot draw a straight, unbroken line from those experiences to the Genesis 11 story. There is no verse that says, "This is Etemenanki." There is no Babylonian account that clearly says, "Once upon a time we all had one language, and then..." The connections are thematic, not explicit. But it is at least plausible that memories of a towering ziggurat called Foundation of Heaven and Earth, rebuilt again and again with enormous imperial effort, fed into later Israelite reflections on what it meant for humans to concentrate power, language, and sacred space in one place. A story about a city and a tower with its top in the heavens does not need an architect's plan of Etemenanki to resonate with people who had stood in its shadow. It only needs the impression such structures leave, that humans, when organized under a strong enough king and a unified enough system, can raise bricks into the sky and claim that the space between heaven and earth runs through them. Genesis takes that feeling and folds it into a compact narrative about speech, ambition, and scattering. The historical Etemenanki dissolves into a more symbolic tower, one that carries traces of real bricks, real kings, and real labour, but is also free to serve as a mirror for larger questions. What kind of unity are we building toward, and what happens when a city tries to make its name the foundation of heaven and earth? Come, let us build ourselves a city, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth. If you've heard the Tower of Babel story many times, that line can slip past almost unnoticed. It sounds like a throwaway motive, a brief aside before the real action begins. But in the world that produced Genesis 11, lest we be scattered names one of the deepest fears a city could have. Because cities, especially early ones, are fragile things. They look solid from a distance. Walls, gates, towers, the bulk of a ziggurat rising from the plain. But those bricks are held together by something much more delicate than bitumen. They're held together by people staying put, by labour showing up where and when it's supposed to, by food arriving on time, by canals being cleared before they silt up, by schedules being kept and promises being honoured. Take away the people and the city dissolves. In the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia this was especially true. The land itself is recent, laid down by rivers that wander and shift. The rainfall is unreliable. Without irrigation, much of the territory is semi-arid. A city here is not nestled in some naturally generous valley. It is imposed on the landscape, maintained by coordinated work. Water has to be lifted and directed into canals. Those canals branch into smaller channels that snake off toward fields. If the upper parts of the system clog, the lower ones run dry. If the banks break, fields flood and salt creeps upward into the soil. If too many households leave, the labour to keep it all going disappears, and the whole delicate hydrological machine starts to falter. Early Mesopotamian cities were, among other things, giant scheduling devices built out of mud brick. Workers had to be mobilised for canal cleaning at the right season before the flow dropped. Harvests had to be brought into central storehouses, measured, recorded, and redistributed. Temple and palace needed grain to feed specialists, craftsmen, scribes, guards, who did not farm for themselves. Herds had to be moved, wool collected, rations assigned, building projects staffed. Behind the monumental facades, you can glimpse this from the tablets the scribes left behind. Lists of labourers assigned to a dig, allocations of barley to work gangs, notices of bricks delivered for a wall or a temple terrace. Everything assumes a basic condition. The people are here, available, countable, directable. Scattering threatens all of that. If families peel away from the city, the overseer has fewer hands for the canal project. If a group of herders decides to move on to some other patron, some other city, or just to more independent pastures, the flow of wool and meat thins. If a conquered population slips back to its old homeland, the tribute they once paid becomes a memory. Lest we be scattered is more than a fear of geographic dispersion. It's an anxiety about losing density, losing the critical mass that makes a city more than just houses clustered together. We know from later Mesopotamian texts that rulers worried constantly about these flows of people. Kings boast that under their reign, the people of the land dwelt in safe pastures, that they made the scattered ones return to their homes, that they restored the people to their settlements. Embedded in these formulas is the opposite possibility, that people might not stay, that they might drift away after famine, war, or political failure. Mobility was everywhere in this world. Caravans crossed deserts with tin, lapis, textiles. Boats moved grain and dates along the rivers. Traders from one city settled as resident foreigners in another. Dependent peasants tried to slip the nets of taxation or corvée labour by running to sanctuary in a different jurisdiction. Conquerors uprooted entire communities, deporting them to distant locations to break resistance or reinforce new frontiers. For the individual, movement could be both opportunity and trauma. A merchant son might travel, learn languages, come back wealthier. A deported craftsman might find himself working on a grand monument in a far-off metropolis with better rations than he had at home. A smallholder driven from his field by drought might seek land on a different canal system. For the city, this same mobility was double-edged. Trade brought wealth, exotic goods, prestige. Migrants brought skills, knowledge of other regions, sometimes loyal service. But the possibility that people could move also meant they could leave, and they did. When rulers failed to keep canals working, when rations dropped, when enemies threatened, population could drain away astonishingly fast. In that light, the Genesis builder's statement becomes almost a mission statement for early urban politics. Let us build ourselves a city, lest we be scattered, could be paraphrased. Let us create a centre so compelling, so strong, so organized, that people will not drift off, that our labour force, our families, our gods, will remain concentrated here rather than dissolving back into the open land. In the story, that desire for concentration gets fused with something else, and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. The tower is the vertical symbol of the same impulse. Raise something so visible, so magnificent, that it anchors identity and draws allegiance. Make a name that people want or are compelled to belong to. And then there is the one language. In Hebrew, the phrase can be read as one lip, one set of words, a single shared speech. At one level, it sets up the later confusion of tongues in the story's plot. But in the context of cities and scattering, it also functions as a metaphor for a certain kind of cohesion. A city that speaks as one is not just linguistically uniform, it is socially aligned. Commands travel clearly from the top of the hierarchy to the bottom. Orders to bring bricks, to dig canals, to prepare grain rations, to appear for work on a given day, are given and understood without friction. Disagreement is muted, or at least does not break into visible factions. We see hints of this in Mesopotamian ideology. Kings present themselves as those who bring right order to speech and behaviour. They boast of establishing just weights and measures, of fixing calendars and festivals, of codifying laws. In practice, multiple dialects, ethnicities, and local traditions always coexisted, but the ideal picture held up in royal inscriptions and hymns is one of a city harmonized under a single will. Lest we be scattered, and one language belong together. The fear that people will fragment physically is paired with a dream that they might be held together by a unified voice. If everyone stays and everyone speaks the same, the city seems strong. If people begin to leave, or even just to imagine leaving that unity phrase, scattering turns into a symbol of political fragility. A king whose subjects abandon him has no city, no labour for his ziggurat, no worshippers for his god. An elite whose orders are garbled or resisted no longer rules effectively. Genesis 11 plays with this logic without spelling it out. The human project in the story is to create unbreakable concentration. One place, one name, one speech, against the looming possibility of dispersion. The divine response will not simply be anger at height or jealousy of architecture, but an intervention in this very system of concentration, an untangling of the tight knot of city, speech, and labour. Before that happens, though, we need to look more closely at what one language meant in the worlds that remembered Babylon and its tower. Not just a linguistic fact, but an administrative longing, a dream of perfectly coordinated people whose words and work always line up. When Genesis says the whole earth had one language and the same words, it is easy to imagine a simple picture. Everyone literally speaking the same tongue, chattering away in perfect mutual comprehension. But in the world of ancient cities and empires, one language evokes something more specific, and in some ways more chilling. The administrative dream of perfect standardization. Empires, even early ones, run on sameness. Not sameness of food or clothing or private habits, those can vary. What has to match are the things that can be counted, commanded, taxed, and mobilized. Weights and measures, calendars and work periods, tax categories and legal formulas, the ratio of barley rations to labour days, the official list of ranks and titles, the wording of oaths. When you read the surviving tablets from Mesopotamian archives, you're not reading people's casual talk. You're looking into the machinery of rule, and that machinery only works when the terms line up. A measure of grain in one town has to be the same measure in another, or the records become meaningless. A conscription order has to be understood the same way by every local official that receives it, or the army doesn't show up when and where it's needed. A royal decree has to be copied accurately and proclaimed consistently, or its force evaporates. For kings, priests, and scribes, one language in this sense is not about the chatter of marketplaces. It's about the language in which orders are written and reality is made legible. Across the ancient Near East we can see this drive toward unification. In 3rd millennium Mesopotamia, Sumerian appears as the prestigious written language of administration and cult, even when many people on the ground probably spoke variant dialects or other tongues entirely. Later, Akkadian becomes the diplomatic and bureaucratic language of large parts of the region. Much later again, Aramaic will serve as an imperial lingua franca from Mesopotamia to Egypt. These languages, in their administrative forms, are remarkably standardized. They come with set formulas for contracts, oaths, petitions, royal orders. They're clothed in writing systems that have been hammered into regularity by generations of scribes copying the same model texts. A scribe in one city and a scribe hundreds of miles away can read and write the same cuneiform signs, use the same formats for listing rations, the same phrases for acknowledging receipt of goods, the same stock expressions for "the king spoke as follows." This is one language as empire experiences it, a controlled medium in which the centre can speak to the periphery, the temple can speak to the fields, the palace can speak to its own past through stored records. But beneath that smooth surface, the spoken world is messy. People in different quarters of the same city can have distinct accents and vocabulary. Merchants learn foreign phrases to bargain with traders from distant regions. Soldiers pick up bits of the languages of the places they garrison. Deportees bring their own mother tongues with them, whispering in homes and marketplaces even as their leaders learn the official speech. We know this not because everyday conversations are preserved, but because the tablets occasionally show the seams. There are lists that give Sumerian words alongside Akkadian, bilingual lexical exercises that reveal scribes being trained to move between tongues. There are loanwords creeping into otherwise standard texts, hints of how languages rubbed against each other. In other words, multilingual reality was the norm. But rulers didn't dream in that key. From the point of view of the palace, all that linguistic variety is potential friction. Every translation step is an opportunity for delay, misunderstanding, or quiet resistance. Every local expression that does not map neatly onto an official term is a place where central control can slip. The administrative imagination longs to flatten this complexity into something smooth, predictable, and obedient. One language, in that imagination, means one set of categories through which the realm can be seen. Think about what a king needs to do: collect taxes, raise labour for projects, draft soldiers, enforce laws, propagate his version of events. Each of those tasks requires communication that travels across distance and down hierarchies. For taxation, you need a way to name taxable things: fields, orchards, flocks, workshops, persons. You need a vocabulary for exemptions and obligations, fines and arrears. If every town calls things by different names, uses different units, keeps books in different habits, the flow of goods toward the centre is constantly snagging on local custom. For conscription, you need categories like able-bodied man, archer, chariot driver, auxiliary, and standardized phrases for orders: who must appear, where, carrying what, under whose command. You need that language to mean the same thing in every district, so that you can predict how many troops will actually stand on a given field when the campaigning season begins. For law, you need consistent formulas for contracts and judgments. Who is a wife, a son, a slave, a debtor? What exactly counts as theft, injury, negligence? The famous law collections from Mesopotamia, Hammurabis, and others before and after do more than present moral ideals. They also represent an attempt to regularize legal speech, to make cases comparable across cities and judges. For royal messaging, you need a stable rhetoric of praise and warning. When a new king affirms that he established justice in the land, or that the weak and the strong were equal before the law, he's not improvising. He's stepping into an existing pattern of imperial speech, one that can be echoed by scribes, recited in temples, understood by officials from one end of the realm to the other. In all of this, a shared administrative language functions like an invisible infrastructure, a canal system for words. It channels commands from the top outward and data from the bottom inward. It allows reports of harvests, lists of workers, and tallies of tribute to be inscribed in forms that can be stored, retrieved, compared. If that language becomes too diverse, if every region insists on its own terminology and dialect in official documents, the flow clogs. The dream of empire is that it will not clog. That dream does not require ordinary people to abandon their mother tongues. It is entirely compatible with villagers chatting in one language at home and being recorded in another on tax tablets. What matters is that, at the points of contact with the state, at the gate where tolls are paid, in the office where rations are measured, in the courtroom where disputes are settled, the words line up with the categories the centre recognises. Here the phrase, one language and the same words, in Genesis 11, starts to feel less like an innocent description and more like a slogan. In the story, the unified speech allows the builders to coordinate. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them, God says. From an administrative perspective, that line could be attached to any successful imperial bureaucracy. Once the language of command and record is sufficiently standardized, the city can attempt almost anything. Massive irrigation works, colossal building projects, complex systems of conscription and resettlement. The Babel story, heard against this background, is not just about people who happen to talk alike. It is about a human project to create a world in which orders never go astray, categorizations never blur, and the city can make its will felt along every canal and caravan route connected to it. But language is never only a tool of control. It is also the vessel of local identity. The words you learn as a child, the proverbs, jokes, and songs of your kin, carry loyalties that do not always align neatly with the centre's needs. When an empire imposes or encourages an official speech, it asks people to inhabit two linguistic worlds at once: the intimate, shifting, context-rich idiom of home, and the frozen, formulaic, impersonal language of the tablet and the decree. For many, the second is a ticket to opportunity. Learn the official tongue, master its written forms, and you can become a scribe, an interpreter, a middleman between village and palace. But it also means carrying the state's categories into your own community, translating neighbours into taxpayers, cousins into conscripts, personal quarrels into legal cases written in someone else's words. So the desire for one language is not neutral. It is bound up with the desire for central control over a landscape full of differences. The builders of Babel, in this light, are not just hoping that neighbours will understand each other. They are, in effect, dreaming of a city whose speech can define reality for everyone within reach of its tower, a city where local variations are either absorbed into the official vocabulary or rendered invisible in the archives. Genesis 11 will soon describe what happens when that dream is interrupted. when the smooth channel of unified speech is broken up into eddies and backwaters. But before we get to scattered tongues, it helps to see how much was at stake in that one administrative language, the canal system of words on which ancient power depended. If one language is the dream, scribes are the dream's gardeners. In Mesopotamia, you did not become a scribe by accident. It was not a casual skill you picked up on the side, like a few phrases in a trading partner's tongue. It was a profession that ate your childhood. From the 3rd millennium onward, we can see the outlines of scribal schools. A boy, almost always a boy, usually from a family with some standing, is sent to the tablet house. There he spends years learning to handle clay, to hold the stylus at the right angle, to press wedge-shaped signs in the correct order and spacing. He copies and recopies the same model texts until his hand can reproduce them almost without thinking. The early stages are brutally repetitive. Lists of signs, lists of numbers, simple phrases over and over. Later, sentences from legal contracts, hymns, royal letters. A scribe's training might last a decade or more, progressing through exercises that were standardized across cities and centuries. This long apprenticeship does more than produce legible handwriting. It forms a particular kind of mind, one that is attuned to categories, sequences and formulae, one that instinctively reaches for established wording instead of improvisation, one that can move between spoken variation and written regularity without getting lost. Writing in this world is not simply a neutral technology. It shapes language itself. When you fix words on clay, you have to decide what counts as the same word across different speakers, accents, and contexts. You choose one spelling over another, one conventional sign over a rival. Over time, those choices harden into norms. Spoken language can drift gently from village to village, absorbing new terms and pronunciations. Written language resists that drift. Once a way of writing a word has been drilled into generations of students, it develops inertia. Tablets from different cities start to look strikingly alike, even if the people speaking behind them sound quite different. In this way, scribal schools act as stabilizers. They keep the written form of Sumerian or Akkadian relatively uniform across space and time. Even when a language is no longer anyone's everyday speech, it can continue to live as a learned, highly controlled medium in the hands of trained specialists. Stability, though, is never free. It comes with gatekeeping. Because the script is complex and the training so long, only a tiny fraction of the population can read and write at a high level. Literacy, in the full sense of being able to produce official documents, is a badge of elite status. The tablet house is a narrow gate into power. Those who pass through it can become temple administrators, royal secretaries, estate managers, judges, diplomatic envoys. They're the ones who turn spoken instructions into written orders, spoken grievances into recorded cases, bags of grain into lines of numbers arranged in neat columns. They also become the guardians of what counts as proper speech in the world of documents. If you bring a complaint in your own words, the scribe translates it into the formulas of legal language. If you dictate a letter, the scribe clothes it in the standard phrases of epistolary politeness. If you swear an oath, the scribe frames it with the correct invocations and penalties. Your reality is filtered through his training. This is where Mesopotamian lexical lists become especially revealing. Among the thousands of tablets excavated from cities like Nippur, Uruk and Nineveh, a long series of words carefully arranged and copied. Lists of trees, animals, professions, cities, metals, star names, lists of gods and their epithets, lists of rare, archaic terms glossed with more familiar equivalents. Many of these lists are bilingual, Sumerian on one side, Akkadian on the other. Sometimes the relationship is not simple translation, but something like a mapping between two different systems of naming. a word used in ritual paired with a more ordinary term, a traditional Sumerian designation matched with the Akkadian phrase that officials actually said aloud. These tablets were school books, but they are also quiet evidence of a multilingual world being tamed for administrative use. A young scribe in, say, Old Babylonian Nippur might grow up speaking Akkadian at home, hearing Sumerian in certain religious settings, and encountering Amorite or other languages in the streets. In the tablet house, he learns that each thing, each role, each place can have multiple names, and that part of his job is to know which name belongs in which register. Lexical lists work like dictionaries and like ideological maps at the same time. They do not just say, this equals that. They say, these are the categories that matter. These are the standard ways of slicing up reality. When such lists circulate between schools, and when scribes trained on them fan out into temple and palace bureaucracies, the written world begins to look far more uniform than the spoken one. Official texts can give the impression that there is a single, precise vocabulary that everyone shares, a settled hierarchy of titles, a fixed set of recognized professions, a canonical roster of gods and cities. On the ground, people may use nicknames, local terms, overlapping job descriptions, shifting cult names. But in the archive, the same few approved phrases keep appearing. The same words for field, tenant, tax, king, priest, slave, son, enemy. The same motifs for chaos and order, guilt and restoration, conquest and mercy. The illusion of uniformity grows out of repetition. Royal inscriptions are a good example. They were copied, recopied, and imitated across generations. A new king might carve his own victories into stone, but he would often do so using language that had already been sanctified by earlier rulers. I enlarged the borders of my land. I restored the ruined temples. I made a name for myself among the 4 quarters of the earth. Those phrases do more than boast. They create a kind of echo chamber. Each inscription reinforces the others, teaching scribes, officials, and priests that this is how kings speak, this is how history is written, this is what it means to make a name. It is striking, then, that in Genesis 11 the builders of the tower say, "Let us make a name for ourselves." The phrase is not uniquely Mesopotamian. It is a human intuition that fame and durability are linked. But heard against the background of royal and temple inscriptions, it has a particular resonance. To make a name in an ancient city is not just to be talked about, it is to be inscribed, to have your name and your deeds written in the durable standardized language that scribes control, to be fixed in the tablets that will be read and recopied in schools long after your bones have turned to dust. And if scribes can make names durable, they can also decide which names fade. Many people live, work, suffer and die in these cities without ever entering the written record. Their speech vanishes with them. The archive remembers the names of kings, high officials, major temples, and large estates, because those are the entities that need to be tracked and celebrated in official language. So when Genesis shows us a city obsessed with its own name and its own tower, it is not hard to imagine a scribal class busily at work in the background, turning that obsession into clay, standardizing the language of the project, writing down the quotas, the rations, the commands, aligning local words with central categories, translating messy speech into clean lines of cuneiform. From that vantage point, one language and the same words is not just a sociological fact, it is a scribal achievement, maintained day after day in the tablet house, and in a multilingual world that achievement requires constant, quiet acts of control, choosing which terms become official and which remain merely colloquial, deciding when to preserve an old, prestigious Sumerian expression and when to gloss it with a more accessible Akkadian phrase, determining which gods, cities and rulers will have their names paired and fixed in lists that students will copy for centuries. The more you see how much labour goes into sustaining this controlled speech, the more the Babel story's anxiety about naming makes sense. A city that can name everything in its own terms, that can fix those names in tablets, that can teach those tablets to each new generation of scribes, is a city that can, in some sense, speak the world into an order that suits it. The next step in the story is to ask what happens when that power slips, when the neat columns of equivalent words no longer line up, and the guardians of language find that their categories can no longer contain the voices around them. Step away from the tablet house for a moment. Imagine walking out of the scribal quarter, past the temple courts and administrative courtyards, down the sloping streets toward the river. The air grows thicker with smells that never make it into royal inscriptions. Frying onions, animal dung, fish laid out on reed mats, crushed dates fermenting in jars. At the edge of the city, or in an open plaza near the main gate, the marketplace spreads out like a living map of everything the careful lists in the school tablets can only hint at. You hear it before you see it. Not one language, but many, braided together. Akkadian spoken in different city accents, Sumerian phrases surfacing in ritual formulas and curses, traders from the West using Amorite or other West Semitic tongues, their words dotted with names of distant oases. Boatmen from the marshes calling to one another in a lilt that marks them as river people. Perhaps Hurrian, Elamite or Anatolian dialects audible in fragments of bargaining, depending on the century and the city. This is the world that the lexical lists are trying to compress into neat pairs of equivalents. Merchants do their own sort of translation long before a scribe touches clay. A cloth dealer from Mari has learned enough Akkadian to argue about prices. A caravan leader from the Zagros knows the numbers in several tongues, plus the words for wool, copper, barley and donkey. A woman selling beer at a street corner may not be literate, but she can switch registers the way a trained diplomat does. One way of speaking with her neighbours, another with a temple official, another with a foreign soldier who pays in unfamiliar coin. Prisoners of war add more voices to this mix. When armies drag captives back from conquered territories, they do not leave their languages on the battlefield. They bring them into kitchens, workshops, and building crews. A cook mutters instructions to an assistant in one tongue, then turns and answers a steward in another. Children in these households grow up hearing both, and often blend them without thinking. Specialists move too. Stoneworkers from the north where good quarries lie, lumber traders from far-off mountains, metallurgists from regions that know copper and tin, diviners famed in one kingdom who are invited, or coerced, to serve in another. Each carries technical vocabulary that may not exist in the local speech, and so loanwords begin to proliferate. A single tool can have 3 names. A plant can be known by a river word in one mouth and a mountain word in another. In this environment, code switching is not a fashionable choice. It is survival. A single sentence may begin in one language and end in another, especially along the seams of trade. A seller might call out prices in the city's main tongue, then drop into a different language for a quick aside to a companion. Terms of endearment, insults, honorifics, and swear words tend to be especially sticky. They often travel with people long after they have switched their primary language for daily use. We do not hear these voices directly, but we can see their shadows. Administrative tablets mention interpreters as an official role. Someone is paid to stand between a local official and foreign envoys, or to facilitate the collection of tribute from people whose words do not quite align with the centre's categories. Diplomatic letters between great kings presume tiered layers of translation. One version composed in the sender's script and language, another rendered into the recipient's tongue by scribes trained to navigate both literary worlds. Even within a single polity, practical multilingualism seems to be the rule rather than the exception. A person might speak one language at home, another in the temple, and another again in the law court. A farmer brought into the city for a legal dispute may need his words rendered into something the scribe can recognize as proper Akkadian. That same scribe, when dealing with ritual matters, may have to wrap his Akkadian thoughts in Sumerian phrases that carry religious weight. This constant negotiation does more than enable commerce. It generates creativity. When people live in linguistic borderlands, they invent. They coin hybrid expressions, playful mistranslations, nicknames that only make sense if you understand two languages at once. Stories travel along these routes and are retold in new accents, woven into local mythologies. Deities from one region acquire titles in another tongue. Their attributes shift slightly with each translation. Loanwords become fossils of contact. A technical term in one language reveals that its speakers once traded with another group who had mastered a particular craft. A borrowed divine name signals an adopted cult, perhaps brought in by merchants and then naturalized in a new city. At the same time, multilingual spaces breed suspicion. To those who control the center, there is something unsettling about not understanding everything being said in the streets. A group of foreigners laughing together may be harmless, or they may be mocking authority. A cluster of workers slipping into their home tongue on a building site might just be sharing news, or they might be complaining about rations and plotting desertion. Texts from various empires show this anxiety in hints and fragments. Edicts that demand the use of a particular language in legal proceedings. Petitions that complain about officials who cannot understand local speech. Occasional boast that the peoples of all tongues have been brought under a king's rule, paired with the quiet admission that their tongues remain different. Within households, too, language can mark boundaries. A child who prefers the prestige language of the palace over the family's mother tongue might be seen as ambitious or disloyal. A foreign wife who never quite masters her husband's speech can be kept at the edges of decision-making. Names themselves carry signals. A child given a local name but called by a foreign nickname at home, or vice versa, inhabits a tiny Babel on their own body. So the marketplace, with its overlapping calls and murmurs, embodies a tension. On the one hand, diversity of speech is ordinary. It is how trade works, how migration unfolds, how empires knit distant regions together. On the other hand, the more voices circulate, the harder it is for any on center, temple, palace, scribal school, to pretend that its language alone defines reality. Genesis 11 takes this messy, dynamic soundscape and presses it into a sharp contrast. The story begins with a flat statement. The whole earth had one language and the same words. Then, in a single divine intervention, that unity fractures. Let us go down and confuse their language, the text has God say, so that they will not understand one another's speech. One tongue becomes many in an instant. Real cities never worked that way. The many tongues were already there, long before anyone imagined a single heavenly moment of confusion. But the storytellers who shaped Genesis were not writing a marketplace ethnography. They were taking the lived reality of multilingual life, its creativity, its frictions, its politics, and turning it into a drama about scale and control. In a sense, they reverse the usual perspective. For scribes and rulers, language diversity is often the problem and standardization the solution. For Genesis 11, the image of a city with one language, one set of words, one project reaching toward heaven, is the dangerous extreme. The break into many tongues is portrayed not only as judgment, but also as a strange kind of protection. To understand that inversion, it helps to hold both pictures in mind at once. The quiet rows of tablets in the school, with their neat columns of paired words, and the noisy marketplace where those words fray into accents, nicknames, and borrowed phrases. The story of Babel sits between them, compressing centuries of gradual mixing and differentiation into a moment when ordered speech slips out of anyone's grasp. Genesis 11 is not the only attempt to turn that slipping, fraying fabric of speech into a story. All over the world, people have looked up from their own marketplaces, listened to the unfamiliar words at their borders, and asked a similar question. How did we end up like this? Why does my neighbour sound almost like me, but not quite? Why does the trader from over the mountains sound as if his tongue is made of different muscles entirely? Why do some prayers feel powerful in one language and thin in another? Myths of language diversity are one way of answering that question without reaching for grammar charts or historical linguistics. They reach for gods, ancestors, and once upon a time. In many traditions, the story begins with an earlier unity. Sometimes that unity is imagined as a single tongue spoken by all humans and the gods together. Sometimes it is more modest, a cluster of related peoples who once understood each other perfectly, before some quarrel, migration, or catastrophe drove them apart. Either way, the present confusion is not taken for granted. It has to be explained. In the ancient Near East and its neighbouring regions, we catch glimpses of stories that do something very close to what Genesis 11 does, though never in exactly the same way. A few fragmentary Sumerian texts, for example, imagine a time when the lands or peoples spoke with one tongue. In one hymn, the god responsible for wisdom and writing appears in a context where languages become divided. The surviving lines are broken and debated, but they hint at a divine role in creating or managing the multiplicity of speech. Later, Mesopotamian traditions preserve another kind of tale. Humans become too noisy, too numerous, or too presumptuous, and the gods respond. Sometimes the response is a flood, sometimes famine or plague, sometimes confusion and discord sent among people. The idea that the gods might mix up human plans by interfering with their ability to cooperate is already present, even if the exact mechanism is not always linguistic. In other cultural spheres, without any historical connection we can be sure of, similar patterns appear. Stories in which deities, spirits, or culture heroes deliberately alter human speech as a punishment, or as a way of separating rival groups. Tales in which a failed attempt to reach heaven, or to seize divine knowledge, results in scattered clans and mutually unintelligible words. Myths in which each tribe is given its own language as a kind of badge, a permanent reminder of some primordial event. It is tempting to see Genesis 11 as simply one local version of a widespread type, the why we speak differently story. But the details matter, and the differences are as important as the resemblances. Across many of these myths, language change is not just an accident, it is an act. Someone with more power than ordinary humans makes a decision. A god is offended, amused, threatened, or simply tired of being surrounded by a single human murmur, and chooses to intervene. The creation of multiple tongues becomes an expression of divine will. In this way, political realities are mapped onto cosmic narratives. In daily life, people might see their neighbours as different because they live under another king, follow other laws, owe tribute to a distant capital. Empires gather many peoples under a single authority, but the differences of dress, ritual, and speech remain stubborn. Border disputes, vassal treaties, and shifting alliances shape who can talk to whom and on what terms. Myths fold these power relations upward into the realm of stories about the gods. If a great empire views itself as the centre of the world, it may imagine its own language as the speech of civilization, and other tongues as remnants of some disruption. Conversely, a small people living in the shadow of empires may imagine that their distinct speech was given by their god as a marker of special identity, something no king of Babylon or Assyria can erase. In some traditions, the proliferation of languages is linked to the breaking of a previous unity that was oppressive. A giant kingdom overreaches, a tyrant tries to make himself like a god, and in the aftermath of his fall, people scatter and speak differently. The new linguistic boundaries echo the new political boundaries. In others, the division of languages is itself the misfortune. Friends can no longer understand each other. Trade falters. Marriages across clan or tribal lines become harder. A world of one voice, associated with an imagined age of harmony, gives way to a world of mishearings and suspicion. Genesis 11 shares this broad human concern, but it frames it in a very particular way. The story opens not with many peoples already distinct, but with the whole earth migrating together and speaking one language and the same words. The first act is not scattering, it is settling. "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower," the people say, "and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Here, diversity is not yet the problem. The problem, in the narrative's own terms, is the refusal to be scattered. The city wants to cancel the centrifugal pull of migration. It wants to fix people in one place, under one project, bound by one shared vocabulary. The tower is part of that project, but so is the desire for one set of words that can organize, command, and define. When the God of Genesis comes down and responds, the two decisive acts are tightly linked, confusing language and scattering people. Let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. Then, from there, the Lord scattered them over the face of all the earth. Language change is not just an after-effect of separation. It is the tool that accomplishes separation. The breakdown of one language becomes the mechanism by which the city's attempt at total coherence is undone. Naming runs through the story as a quiet thread. The builders want to make a name for themselves. In the world of the Hebrew Bible, to make a name is to secure reputation, permanence, and a kind of memorial presence. Elsewhere in Genesis, God promises to make Abraham's name great. Here, the collective city seeks that greatness for itself. The outcome, however, is a different name, Babel. The text plays on the similarity between Babel and the Hebrew verb for to confuse or to mix. In Akkadian, the language of Babylonia, the city's name probably meant Gate of the God. In Genesis, that prestigious imperial name is gently twisted into a memorial of failure. Not the gate to heaven, but the place where God mixed up human speech. This is one of the places where Genesis 11 quietly diverges from other ancient stories that may have circled around similar themes. Some Mesopotamian traditions celebrate the greatness of cities and their temples, presenting them as the natural result of divine favor and human cooperation. Even when gods punish noisy or rebellious humans, the focus often falls on reducing population or lifespan, not on the dangers of a unified urban project. Genesis, by contrast, turns the spotlight on the city's ambition to erase distance and difference. The one language, the single project, the reaching tower, these are not treated as the ideal state lost in some fall. They are the condition from which humanity must be pried loose. The moral framing is distinctive. The multiplication of languages is not merely an unfortunate side effect of divine anger, nor simply a neutral explanation of cultural variety. It functions as a restraint on human overconcentration, a safeguard against any one centre, political, economic or religious, claiming the whole earth as a single obedient audience. In this way, the story takes a question many cultures ask: why so many tongues? And gives it a sharply anti-imperial twist. Like other myths, it projects onto the heavens what people see on earth: cities rising and falling, rulers trying to standardize speech, local dialects resisting, migrations scattering communities. But it also suggests that the drift toward one language, one tower, one name is not the cure for human problems, but one of their expressions. Other traditions will tell different versions of the same puzzle. They will imagine gods allotting languages as tribal inheritance, or tales of brothers whose quarrels give rise to mutually unintelligible speech. They will link words to bloodlines, to sacred mountains, to lost golden ages. Genesis 11 stands among these stories not as a solitary invention, but as one particular answer to a shared set of questions. It remembers a world of many languages and many peoples under the long shadow of real cities like Babylon, and says, this is not an accident, nor is it merely a wound. It is at least in part a deliberate unmaking of something that should not have been allowed to grow unchecked. From here, the narrative will move away from the city and follow one wandering family. But before it does, it leaves us with this image: a great unfinished project, a broken name, and a human world speaking in many voices, not because it failed to reach heaven, but because no single city was meant to hold all speech in its walls. The turning point of the story is a sentence that sounds almost casual. Let us go down and see the city and the tower that the humans are building. The text has already told us that the tower's top is meant to reach the heavens. The builders imagine themselves raising a structure that erases the boundary between earth and sky. Yet when the narrative voice shifts, the picture changes. The God of Genesis has to come down just to get a good look. It is a literary joke so quiet you almost miss it. From the ground, the city feels enormous, world-defining, the natural centre of everything that matters. From the heavenly viewpoint, the story invites us to imagine it is so small that it needs special inspection. The descent is not about God needing to travel. It is about the perspective of the reader being gently tilted. The same device appears elsewhere in the Bible. In later passages, the God of Israel is said to come down to see oppression in Egypt, or to look down from heaven on human affairs. The language is anthropomorphic, built out of everyday spatial experience, but it signals something more than simple movement. It signals a change in scale. In Genesis 11, that change of scale exposes the gap between human self-perception and cosmic significance. From the builder's point of view, they are on the verge of something unprecedented. A city that can hold everyone. A tower that cancels the vertical distance to the divine realm. A name that will endure. They are thinking in terms of maximum reach. The whole earth, the top of heaven, a reputation that defies scattering. From the let us go down point of view, the city is another local construction. One more ambitious project on a small patch of ground. It may matter enormously to the people involved and to those living under its authority, but it is not the axis on which the cosmos turns. To ancient ears steeped in temple hymns and royal inscriptions, this contrast would have been particularly sharp. In Mesopotamian literature, cities can be described as the very foundation of cosmic order. Their walls separate cultivated land from wilderness. Their temples anchor the gods to earthly locations. Ziggurats are portrayed as binding points between heaven and earth, mountains of brick that stabilize the universe by giving the gods a reliable dwelling place in the human world. Kings routinely cast their building projects as restorations of a pre-existing cosmic plan. When Sargon or Hammurabi or Nebuchadnezzar raises a temple, he is not merely adding to the skyline. He is aligning his city with the way things are supposed to be. Against that backdrop, Genesis 11 quietly questions whether every claim of cosmic significance should be taken at face value. Reaching the heavens is likely an idiom in the story, not a literal claim that people were attempting some kind of ancient space program. In Akkadian and other languages of the region, similar phrases describe tall structures, lofty palaces, impressive mountains. A house whose head reaches heaven is simply high, magnificent, imposing. A king who makes his rule as high as heaven is boasting of unmatched power. The builder's tower belongs to that world of hyperbolic language. Their structure aspires to be the greatest thing they can imagine, something that participates in heaven, that lays claim to divine territory. The story never pauses to discuss engineering challenges. It is not about bricks versus stars, it is about symbolic scale. From a traditional reading, the critique is straightforward. Human beings are trying to cross a line meant for the divine. They are climbing too high, not physically, but in their sense of who they are and what they can control. Pride becomes the key word. The descent of God is the movement of judgment, the moment when overreaching ambition is seen from above and found wanting. But other layers are possible. The problem may not only be that the builders want to go up, but that they want to pull everything else in. In the narrative, the city is not just tall, it is centripetal. It wants to draw all people into one enclosed system. One speech, one project, one name, one centre. From that angle, the let us go down moment is less a reaction to height and more a reaction to scale gone wrong. In many ancient cosmologies, order depends on a balance between unity and separation. The heavens and the earth are distinct but related. Seas have their boundaries. Different lands belong to different gods or to different appointed rulers. Powers are distributed. The world is not imagined as a single homogeneous field under a single human command. The project at Babel tilts hard toward homogenization. Its one language is not simply a happy accident of mutual understanding. It is the operating system of a total project. Its tower is not just pious architecture. It is a way to enclose the sacred within the city's reach. Its name is not only a reputation, it is a claim to enduring identity that does not depend on any higher grant. Read this way. The divine descent is a response to over-centralization. What looks to the builders like the pinnacle of civilization, everyone coordinated, everyone in one place, all speaking the same way, looks from the narrative's higher vantage point like a dangerous compression of human life into a single mould. The line, "This is only the beginning of what they will do," is often heard as a complaint about potential technological power, as if the issue were that humans might start inventing machines that challenge the divine. It can also be heard as a concern about unchecked capacity for collective action. When all speech and all ambition are channeled through one city, one leadership, one vocabulary, what happens to those who do not fit that program? Genesis 11 does not spell out the social realities inside the city. It never mentions kings, overseers, or forced labour. Yet in the world from which the story emerges, the building of great monumental structures almost always involved hierarchies, conscripted workers, and the concentration of resources in the hands of a few. The impulse to hold people tightly, to prevent them from scattering, can be protective. It can also be controlling. So some readers across history have seen in Babel not only a caution against human pride, but a critique of oppressive unity. A world with only one authorized language is a world where dissent has trouble finding words. A city that keeps everyone from wandering may be sheltering them from danger, or it may be keeping them under surveillance. A project that claims to speak for the whole earth may be erasing the distinct stories and callings of different communities. From that perspective, the confusion of language is not merely a punishment, it is disruption of an emerging totality. It is as if the narrative is saying, there is a scale at which human cooperation is beautiful and life-giving, and there is a scale at which it becomes suffocating. Families, clans, villages, even small cities can coordinate without swallowing the world. But when a single centre tries to become the entire horizon, something in the fabric of creation resists. The story does not define this boundary precisely. It does not give a rule about how big a city may be, or how many people can share one language before it becomes dangerous. Instead, it offers a picture, a building site, a chorus of identical voices, a descent, an intervention, a scattering, This open-endedness is part of its enduring pull. If the text wanted to be absolutely clear, it could have stated God's motive in unambiguous terms. Because they are arrogant, I will scatter them. Because their unity is unjust, I will divide them. Instead, the reasons are hinted at rather than fully laid out. Pride is certainly implied. Anxiety about what they will do is voiced. Concern about unbounded collective power is suggested. But the narrative never reduces the event to a single moral. That leaves room for different generations to hear different warnings in the same words. An empire might hear a caution about boasting in its towers and its centralized bureaucracy. A small group preserving its identity might hear reassurance that no single city, however powerful, will be allowed to swallow all cultures and all speech. Individuals might hear a more personal reminder that human projects, however necessary, are not the final measure of meaning in the world. The descent in Genesis 11 is, in that sense, not just spatial. It is also interpretive. It invites us to step out of the view from inside the city, where everything looks huge and inevitable, and to consider a wider horizon where even the tallest tower is a temporary arrangement on a crowded planet. It suggests that there are limits to the scale at which human plans can safely operate, limits built not only into our physical capacities, but into the very pattern of the world as the text imagines it. And then, just as we're adjusting to this new vantage point, the story will move on. The city fades into the background. The camera follows a single family stepping away from the ruins of the grand project. The problem of human scale will now be explored not through bricks and towers, but through journeys, promises, and the slow unfolding of a people who will never fully escape the pull of great cities, or the temptation to speak with one controlling voice. The turning point comes in a pair of brief lines that almost sound like a technical fix. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. The response to an all-encompassing project is not fire from heaven, not flood, not plague. It is miscommunication. At first glance, this looks simply like thwarting. People can no longer coordinate, so the worksite collapses. The bricks lie unused. The tower halts in mid-construction. The city's grand design never reaches its advertised height. But the verb behind confuse can also mean to mix, to stir, to blend together. The image is not of language being destroyed. It is of language being complicated. From inside the city, that complication feels like loss. What had been effortless becomes laborious. Instructions need repeating. Jokes fall flat. Negotiations stall. The same word suddenly means different things to different people. The easy assumption that everyone shares the same frame of reference is gone. From outside the city, that same complication looks like a barrier placed in front of a totalizing project. The builder's dream depends on a frictionless medium, one speech, one set of commands, one unbroken line from planners to workers. They're not merely using language. They're relying on its uniformity as the backbone of their control. Once the speech of the people splinters, that backbone gives way. We can imagine some trying to stay, small clusters of mutual understanding forming on different corners of the building field. A group over here that still follows one foreman, another group over there whose words no longer quite match. The text moves quickly, but the implication is clear. Language diversity pushes people to separate. Those who can understand each other gather, those who cannot drift apart. In many human stories, fragmentation is the disaster. Communities break, families are scattered, shared memory frays. In the biblical narrative, exile and dispersal often carry grief. Psalmists weep by foreign rivers. Prophets mourn broken kingdoms. Yet in Genesis 11, scattering is also a solution to an earlier fear. The builders are explicit. They want their city and tower lest we be scattered over the face of all the earth. They see dispersal as a threat to their identity, their security, their name. The narrative inverts that instinct. What they dread becomes the instrument by which oppressive unity is dismantled. Fragmentation here is double-edged. On one edge, it breaks dangerous concentrations of power. No single center can any longer claim to speak effortlessly for the whole earth. Speech communities multiply. Projects become local again. The reach of any one city's commands is shortened simply because its language does not carry as far. On the other edge, fragmentation introduces new vulnerabilities. Misunderstanding is not only a limit on empire, it is also a seed of conflict. Anthropologists and historians can point to countless cases where differences in speech, custom, or story become markers of us and them. The very diversity that preserves distinct cultures can harden into boundaries that justify suspicion or violence. The text of Genesis 11 does not trace that trajectory explicitly, but later chapters will. Nations will jostle, cities will war, misunderstandings between groups will have real costs. So the confusion of language is not portrayed as a simple blessing. It is a rough mercy, one that protects by dividing, and divides in ways that will need later healing. The story holds this tension without resolving it. It is here that the question of uniformity becomes sharp. When everyone speaks the same way, decisions move quickly, orders are clear, grand schemes are possible. From the inside, such uniformity can feel like peace, like harmony. From the outside, or from beneath, it can feel like the silence of dissent, a system that permits only one authorized speech, one official vocabulary, has enormous capacity for coordinated building. It also has enormous capacity for coordinated harm. Ancient readers knew this from experience. Royal inscriptions from Mesopotamia proudly display how a king made all the land speak with one mouth under his rule. The metaphor is flattering when applied to grain deliveries, canal maintenance, or temple restoration. It is more troubling when applied to military campaigns, forced labor, or the suppression of rebels. When there is only one mouth, what happens to all the other tongues? Genesis 11 never shows the tower becoming a center of overt violence. No whips crack in the text, no armies march out from its base. Yet later biblical traditions and later Jewish and Christian imagination will associate Babylon precisely with imperial aggression, with deportations, sieges, and the swallowing of other people's songs. Against that larger backdrop, the confusion of language can be read as a preemptive limit, not a punishment aimed primarily at shaming the builders, but a restraint aimed at protecting the rest of the world from what unlimited, unanswerable human unity might do. At the same time, nothing in the story suggests that cooperation itself is wrong. The Bible will go on to praise shared worship, collective justice, mutual aid. What is questioned is not the fact of people working together, but the attempt to bring all human life under one abstractly managed project whose scale erases particular callings and stories. The language of the divine speech captures this ambiguity. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. That line can sound like envy, or like alarm at human creativity. It can also be heard as a sober recognition. Beings who can coordinate this completely will have no built-in breaks. Their achievements and their atrocities will both be amplified. If that is the concern, then the confusion of the language becomes a kind of external break, an imposed limitation that reality itself will not otherwise provide. Human plans are not destroyed, but they are redirected. Instead of one colossal city claiming the horizon, many smaller communities will arise with their own ways of speaking, their own partial views of the world. Over and over, the biblical story will return to this pattern of limit. The sea has a boundary and does not cross it. The Sabbath breaks the endless drive to labor. Kings have constraints placed on their power. Even the chosen people are told that the land is not ultimately theirs to own without regard. It has its own rhythms and rights. In that long arc, the confusion at Babel becomes one more example of a limit that is both painful and protective. It frustrates a dream of seamless control, but it opens space for plurality. It disrupts the fantasy of one center that needs no outside, but in doing so, it creates outsides, places and peoples that can develop without being absorbed. The narrative does not claim that this arrangement is ideal. It simply presents it as the way things are in the wake of intervention. People will now live in many lands, speak many languages, carry many partial understandings of the world. Misunderstanding will haunt them. So will the memory of a time when everyone spoke the same way. Later texts will imagine moments when that barrier is crossed again, when people of many tongues hear one message each in their own language, without losing their distinct speech. But Genesis 11 itself stays with the scattering. It leaves us in the tension between unity and diversity, between the safety of limits and the ache they create. The city is left unfinished, its tower unnamed in the story. What receives a name instead is the confusion itself. Babel becomes shorthand not only for human arrogance, but for the mysterious decision that the world should not be held forever under one voice, one plan, one brick-coloured sky. Centuries after anyone first told the story of a city with one language, a small kingdom on the western edge of the Fertile Crescent watched real towers rise on a very real Babylonian skyline. For people from Judah, Babylon stopped being just a distant place in old trade routes and became the name of the empire that broke their walls, burned their temple, and marched their leaders away in chains. Suddenly, the memory of a city that feared scattering was no longer an abstract warning. It was an interpretive lens, because now they were the scattered ones. The biblical narrative will speak of people by the rivers of Babylon, hanging up their harps, unable to sing their familiar songs in a foreign land. That line is not from Genesis, but it gives us a feeling for the world in which Genesis 11 was treasured, edited, and heard. Imagine being a scribe, far from Jerusalem, living under the shadow of massive ziggurats and palace complexes, watching an imperial machine run on precisely the things Babel had dramatized. Standardized speech, centralized labor, carefully managed building projects. You would walk through streets where a single written language, Akkadian in cuneiform, later joined by an elevated literary variety of Aramaic, served administration from one end of the empire to the other. You would hear edicts proclaimed in formulas that echoed from province to province. You would know that your fate depended on which words appeared on which tablet in some archive you would never see. In that environment, the old story about a city, a tower, and a confusion of tongues might start to sound different. Instead of a strange episode from a distant primordial age, it begins to feel like a pattern. Human power reaches for total coordination, draws people into one grand project, and then something fractures. The fracture hurts, but it also keeps the project from swallowing everything. For an exiled community, language becomes one of the sharpest edges of that fracture. On one hand, learning the imperial tongue is a path to survival. Some displaced Judeans rose to positions of influence as they absorbed Babylonian and later Persian languages, legal formulas, and court customs. Their stories survive in books like Daniel and Esther, where translation and renaming are constant themes. On the other hand, that same learning threatens to erode older identities. Children born in foreign cities may grow up speaking the imperial language more easily than their parents' Hebrew. Names change. Prayers need glosses. The very sounds that once marked a people as distinct begin to blur. Exile often heightens sensitivity to these shifts. When you live at home, surrounded by people who share your accent, your jokes, your proverbs, language can feel invisible, like air. When you are displaced, every word reminds you of where you are not. You notice which phrases stumble on your tongue, which idioms carry memories others do not share. You also notice the power language has to include and to exclude. An imperial official who speaks to you only through an interpreter can decide your family's fate. A decree written in a script you cannot read can redraw borders, redirect taxes, authorize deportations. The city that makes all lands speak with one mouth rarely does so by simple persuasion. It does so by rewarding those who take its speech into their own mouths and marginalizing those who cannot or will not. In that light, the builder's dream in Genesis 11 begins to resemble an empire's dream of seamless rule. One lip, one words, is not just about pleasant communication. It is about the fantasy that no command will meet resistance in misunderstanding, that no community will be able to hide behind its own terms for the world. The story's divine response, mixing, stirring, complicating speech, can be heard as a counter-move on behalf of all the voices such a system would flatten. For people who had just experienced what happens when one city claims universal reach, that counter-move would speak both to trauma and to awe. Trauma, because they knew from the inside what it meant to have their own city's walls torn down, their sacred architecture reduced to rubble, their own dreams of stability scattered. Awe, because they sat in the heart of the empire that had done it and saw that empire's scale, organization, and learning. Babylon was not only a place of humiliation, it was also a center of astonishing knowledge. Astronomers charted the heavens from its rooftops. Scribes copied texts from cultures older than Israel itself. Law codes, omen collections, rituals, and myths circulated in its tablet houses. Judean exiles could not help but be impressed. The same city whose armies had dragged them away was also a place where ideas from all over the Near East met, were catalogued, and refined. The ziggurat that loomed over Babylon was not just a symbol of arrogance. It was also a symbol of technical sophistication, of a society that could marshal countless workers, bricks, and logistical chains. So Babylon became two things at once in Israelite memory: a real city of learning, where some of their own scribes likely studied, adapted, and translated, and a symbol of domination, shorthand for any system that pulls people into its orbit and rearranges their lives to fit imperial needs. The story of Babel sits right at that intersection. On some readings, its earliest form may go back to older Mesopotamian motifs about temple towers and divine jealousy. Later Judean storytellers and editors living through or remembering exile could have picked up such motifs and reshaped them, letting the name Babel resonate both with the great city on the Euphrates and with the older Hebrew verb for mixing and confusion. Scholars debate the details. Some suggest that the narrative reached something like its present form in circles influenced by Babylonian scribal culture, where comparisons with ziggurats and royal inscriptions were vivid rather than theoretical. Others argue for a longer process, with materials from different periods woven together into the compact text we now read. The precise timeline is uncertain, and the text itself does not tell us. What we can say is that, whenever the story took on its final contours, it now sits in a collection shaped by people who knew exile first-hand or by deep communal memory. They had watched kingdoms rise and fall. They had felt what it was to be gathered under someone else's project and then scattered again. They had learned what it meant to preserve a distinctive voice within a world that pressed towards sameness. Communities under that kind of pressure often turn experience into narrative. They do not simply write chronicles of dates and edicts. They compose stories that capture patterns, how pride leads to downfall, how centralization breeds both glory and vulnerability, how limits appear at the very moment when power seems most unlimited. Genesis 11, read from within that long history, looks less like a random myth of origins and more like one of those pattern stories. It remembers the awe that cities inspire, their towers, their coordination, They're archives of knowledge. It remembers the harm they can do when they seek to bind all life into their own ordered grid. It encodes both in a scene of bricks and speech, ascent and dispersal. For exiles, such a story is a way to hold trauma without letting it define everything. Babylon may have seemed invincible on the day its armies breached Jerusalem's walls. But in the story of Babel, the mightier city is just another human attempt to grasp at the sky, subject to limits written into the fabric of the world. At the same time, the confusion that follows is not romanticized. The pain of scattering is real, and those who tell the story know it from the inside. They live in the tension between longing for home, a place where their own language feels at ease, and recognizing that no single city, not even their own, is meant to become the horizon for all humanity. In that tension, memory does its quiet work. It takes the sight of foreign towers and foreign tongues, the sting of decrees in unfamiliar scripts, the strange beauty of new learning, and folds them into an old question. What happens when humans try to close the gap between earth and heaven with their own systems? The answer is not given as a lecture. It is given as a short, puzzling tale about a city called Babel, a tale that carries, in its brief lines, the long shadow of a real empire, and the voices of people who lived beneath its walls and then beyond them. As generations passed, that short, puzzling tale did not stay fixed. It kept being read and reread, each age finding in it a mirror for its own anxieties. Within Jewish traditions, Babel became closely linked with the question of pride. Some early interpreters imagined the builders not just as ambitious architects, but as rebels who wanted to storm heaven itself. Later, Midrash would picture people shooting arrows into the sky, or organizing work so ruthlessly that if a brick fell and broke, everyone mourned the brick. But if a worker fell and died, no one noticed. In those retellings, the problem is no longer just the desire for one language. It is the way a centralized project can begin to value its own continuity more than the lives of the people inside it. The tower becomes a symbol of human systems that forget their own limits. At the same time, the story is tied to idolatry. A city that says, "Let us make a name for ourselves," begins to sound like a temple state in miniature, creating a human-made focus of devotion to replace trust in the unseen. Later Jewish writers, thinking with the trauma of exile still close by, could hear Babel as a warning. When a community's security rests on monuments and slogans, it is closer to collapse than it thinks. Christian readers inherited all of this and added new layers. In the New Testament, Babylon becomes a coded name for Rome, another empire with grand architecture, efficient administration, and a tendency to crush resistance. The old story about a tower and a confusion of tongues now lives in the background whenever early Christians talk about proud cities, imperial arrogance, or the fragility of human power. But Christian tradition also does something unusual with Babel. It sets it alongside another story about language, the Feast of Pentecost. In the Book of Acts, a group of Jesus' followers gather in Jerusalem during a pilgrimage festival. They begin to speak, and people from many regions, Parthians, Medes, Egyptians, visitors from Rome, hear them, each in their own language. The scene is filled, in the text, with imagery of wind and fire and astonishment. But underneath the vivid details is a simple reversal. Instead of one language being broken into many, many languages are held together in one moment of understanding. Later preachers seized on this contrast. They called Babel the confusion of tongues and Pentecost the gift of tongues. At Babel, the human project splinters and people scatter because they no longer understand one another. At Pentecost, a divine gift allows mutual understanding without erasing difference. The languages do not disappear, they are honoured, and yet something passes through them that makes communication possible. For some Christian thinkers, this became a way to say, the problem at Babel was not plurality itself. It was the attempt to lock the world into one uniform pattern, to build a tower of sameness that reached the heavens. In their telling, Pentecost does not return humans to that lost uniformity. It creates a different kind of unity, based not on one official speech but on a shared message that can be translated into any tongue. Jewish interpreters, too, sometimes played with reversals. In some traditions, the confusion of languages is not only a punishment but also a protection. It keeps any one empire from swallowing all others. It ensures that Torah, wisdom, and prayer will always find new homes, new pronunciations, new melodies. Later mystical texts might look forward to a time when deeper understanding would again traverse the boundaries between languages, not by abolishing them, but by revealing the connections beneath. As the centuries moved into the medieval period, the story of Babel began to do new kinds of work. Scholars in monasteries and yeshivot, in Islamic courts and Christian universities, argued about what the world's original language had been. Some said Hebrew, others proposed different candidates. The question was not only linguistic, it touched on theology, on the dignity of particular peoples, on the imagined order of creation. Babel became a reference point in debates over translation. If God had once scattered speech, what did it mean to render sacred texts into many vernaculars? Was that a further fall from purity, or a kind of gentle healing of the divide? Jewish translators of the Bible into Aramaic, Greek, and later Arabic, Christian translators into Latin and the emerging European languages, Muslim thinkers reflecting on the Arabic of the Quran, all could see themselves in one way or another as living with the consequences of Babel. Politically, the story also proved useful. Medieval rulers and theorists could invoke it when considering the advantages and dangers of linguistic unification. Some imagined that a single imperial language would bring peace and order. Others, reading Genesis 11, worried that too much centralization invited the kind of humbling that Babel dramatized. Commentaries from these periods sometimes slide easily from discussing brick-making and towers to discussing law codes, oaths of allegiance, and the ethics of conquest. In early modern Europe, as exploration connected continents and new languages came into contact, Babel took on yet another role. It became a way to think about the bewildering multiplicity of tongues reported by travellers. Were all these languages the result of a single ancient catastrophe? Did they prove human division or human creativity? Philosophers and theologians proposed grand schemes to classify them, or to reconstruct the primordial speech they believed lay behind them. Some imagined that, if only that original language could be recovered, perfect knowledge or perfect politics might follow. Against this backdrop, the rise of modern linguistics brought a quiet shift. 19th and 20th century scholars began to trace relationships between languages not through a single dramatic event, but through patterns of sound change, borrowing, and migration over deep time. Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, Sino-Tibetan, and other language families emerged as ways of mapping slow divergence rather than sudden shattering. In this new light, Babel was no longer used as a literal explanation for how French, Amharic, and Mandarin came to be different. Instead, it became a story about something else, about how humans perceive diversity, and about the unease that large systems feel when they cannot reduce that diversity to one standard. Yet even as scientific models grew more detailed, the old narrative did not vanish. It kept being told in synagogues and churches, invoked in literature and film, cited in discussions about nation-states, global English, and machine translation. Each reinterpretation reveals as much about its own era as about the ancient text. For communities under empire, Babel speaks about arrogance and the mercy of limits. For theologians thinking about Pentecost, it becomes a way to imagine understanding that does not depend on sameness. For medieval glossators, it shapes questions of authority in translation. For modern linguists, it stands as a mythic counterpart to the slow, impersonal processes they study. Across all these layers, one thread remains. People keep returning to this brief story when they want to talk about how far human coordination should go and what might be lost or gained when one language seeks to rule them all. In that sense, the many interpretations are themselves a kind of counterpoint to the city's original dream. The builders imagined one speech, one project, one name. History answered with a chorus of readings, each in its own idiom, each quietly reworking the tale to speak to new circumstances. The story that once warned against a single tongue becomes, over time, a gathering place for many. If we step back now and look at the whole arc of this story, one tension comes into focus. On the one hand, unity is power. Every ancient city knew this. One harvest shared through common storehouses can carry people through a bad year. One calendar, one set of festivals, can synchronize planting, trading, and worship. One law code, copied on tablets and set up in public places, can reduce endless small conflicts to something that feels like order. Language sits at the center of all of that. A shared tongue lets decrees travel farther than any king. It lets a tax demand written in a palace be understood, word for word, in a village days away. It lets instructions for building walls and canals be relayed down a chain of foremen, overseers and labourers, until hundreds or thousands of bodies move as if they were one. For rulers, this looks like safety. Chaos becomes legible. Difference becomes manageable. The world feels for a moment as though it can be held together. But for the people who live under that system, one language can also look like one chain of command. The same clarity that lets a law protect you can also let a law reach you. A list of conscripted workers, read aloud in the court, becomes a list of men who will carry bricks. A standard way of speaking means there is also a standard way of accusing, of testifying, of confessing. The words that make contracts possible also make punishments possible. Ancient cities understood this ambivalence, even if they never named it directly. In Mesopotamia, royal inscriptions praise kings who made all the land speak with one mouth, but the mythic texts that survive do not always celebrate those projects without a shadow of doubt. Stories about gods confusing plans, overturning cities, or refusing to endorse a king's building program point to an anxiety under the praise. If one voice commands everything, there is very little room left to say no. Genesis 11 catches that anxiety in miniature. The builder's dream of one language and the same words is not just about whether a potter from the north can haggle with a shepherd from the south. It is about whether the city can organize itself so completely that no part of it can easily slip away. Lest we be scattered, they say, revealing what they truly fear. Not enemies, not famine, but the loss of coordination. Yet scattering, in the older human story we traced at the beginning of this episode, is also a form of protection. Small bands separated by distance, speaking in slightly different ways, are harder to control as a single unit. No one drought, no one tyrant, no one slogan can seize all of them at once. Difference diffuses risk. Ancient cities developed many techniques to live with this fact. Languages multiplied in their streets regardless of royal preference. Merchants brought new terms for spices, fabrics, and weights. Migrants arrived with their own gods' names and family stories. Conquered peoples spoke their mother tongues at home, even if they learned the empire's language at work. To keep such a place governable, city elites did not simply erase difference. They managed it. Law was one tool. A legal code, even in a single official language, acknowledges that there are many ways people might act. It creates categories, free and slave, citizen and foreigner, priest and layperson, and assigns different rules to each. The law does not unify everyone. It orders their differences into a hierarchy that can be administered. Ritual was another tool. Festivals brought the city together, but often by assigning each group a part to play. This quarter brings offerings of grain, that quarter processions of musicians, another the priests who speak the old sacred language. Diversity is choreographed into a pattern that reinforces the centre. Architecture did similar work in stone and brick. Walls separated districts, gates channeled movement, temples and palaces rose above surrounding houses, making a vertical map of who mattered most. A ziggurat in the skyline told everyone without words where the axis of the city's life was supposed to be. And then there were the stories. Myths, hymns, and origin tales explained why boundaries existed and why they should be maintained. A people might be told that their distinct language was a gift from a particular god or a sign of their special role. At the same time, they might be urged to use the imperial tongue in court, in trade, in ritual. The stories smoothed the friction between the many and the one. Read in this light the anxiety in Babel's single sentence about the whole earth having one language is not only religious or moral, it is political. If everyone speaks the same way, then everyone can be reached by the same orders. If everyone shares the same metaphors and proverbs, it becomes easier to persuade them with the same speeches. If everyone swears by the same formulas, then their loyalties are easier to map and to demand. But this same clarity has a cost. It can weaken the small pockets of difference that make resistance possible. It can allow a city's leadership to move too quickly, to launch vast building projects or military campaigns without the natural friction that comes from negotiating across linguistic and cultural boundaries. It can tempt a community into thinking that, because they all understand one another, they cannot be wrong. The mystery we have been circling, why tell a story in which a god fears human unity and responds by multiplying languages, may have several overlapping answers. Perhaps the story remembers an old intuition that absolute coordination is dangerous, not only for the divine human boundary, but for humans themselves. Perhaps it encodes the experience of people who lived under empires where the official language carried both law and threat, and who found in the confusion of tongues a strangely protective blur. Perhaps it's a way of saying that there are scales of organization beyond which human projects become brittle, that a tower, a city, an empire held together by one voice is impressive and also precarious, because any flaw in that voice reaches everywhere at once. Or perhaps it is all of these at once, and more besides, a reflection on memory after exile, a meditation on pride, a quiet defense of local speech and local gods against the flattening pressure of the metropolis. However we read it, the story does not end with a city smashed to dust. It ends with a softer image, work interrupted, plans abandoned, people gradually drifting apart in search of new homes. The tower still stands there in the background, half complete. The crowd that once spoke in perfect unison has broken into clusters, each turning to one another with new sounds that they are only beginning to understand. Somewhere in that moment is the realization that coordination can fail, that messages can be garbled, that chains of command can fray, that no single language can pull every human being into its orbit forever. For ancient cities, that prospect was both a terror and a relief. The terror of losing control, of seeing the carefully aligned bricks of society slip out of place, and the relief of knowing that nothing human, not even the most unified of systems, can truly become the whole world. Between those two feelings, the story of Babel hangs, still asking its quiet question about how much unity we should wish for, and what kinds of difference we might need in order to remain human. If you let the scene fade now, the unfinished tower and the drifting crowds grow smaller, until they are just one story among many layered on the same patch of earth. Ziggurats rise and fall. Empires standardize and then fracture. New languages appear in the cracks of old ones. And somewhere in a later age, a scribe copies the lines of Genesis 11 onto a scroll, preserving this brief, quiet parable about a city that tried to make its voice the only one that mattered. What lingers is not the judgment, or even the building project, but the feeling of standing between belonging and limit. Language is where both of those live. We speak to be understood, to feel at home with those who know our words and our jokes and our shared memories. Yet we also discover, sometimes unexpectedly, that our words cannot cross every boundary. There are people we love whose first language we will never fully master. There are idioms that do not translate, songs that lose something when they are carried into another tongue. Babel, as the tradition has received it, sits in that in-between space. It is not only a story about a god breaking a machine of human unity. It is a meditation on the fact that every language both connects and separates, that every community that says we also, unavoidably, gestures at a they. The ancient world knew this intimately. Merchants in Babylon, traders in Ugarit, farmers near Jerusalem, all had to move between registers, the mother tongue at home, the regional dialect in the market, the imperial language in court. Belonging was layered. You could feel utterly at ease in one circle of speech and strangely clumsy in another, even when you were standing in the same street. Genesis 11 does not erase that complexity. It frames it. It suggests that perhaps human beings were not meant to have a single, uninterrupted line of coordination stretching over all the earth. That perhaps there is wisdom in the way meaning phrase at the edges when it is pushed too far from its source. That perhaps our limits are not only punishments, but protections. Of course, the story does not answer its own questions in a way that satisfies every listener. It does not tell us exactly how languages multiplied, or whether this was a once-for-all event or an image drawn from the slow drift of dialects over time. It does not explain why some tongues became imperial, while others stayed local. It does not settle the debate over whether unity itself is the problem, or only what the builders hope to do with it. Those silences can be frustrating. They can also be where the story's power lives. Because when a text leaves space, it creates a place for generations to enter. Rabbis, church fathers, medieval commentators, modern scholars, and ordinary readers have all stepped into Babel's gaps with their own worries and hopes. Some have read it as a warning against pride, others as a defense of cultural diversity, others still as a memory of empire's reach and exile's bruise. Each reading says as much about its own time and place as it does about the ancient city on the plain of Shinar. Our own world comes to the story with different concerns. We live with something the builders of Babel could never have imagined. Nearly instantaneous communication that can circle the globe in seconds. We send messages that can reach millions of people who will never meet one another in person. We create digital platforms that, for a moment, make it feel as though the whole earth is once again one speech. This has its own version of the old promise. Shared tools, shared terms, shared protocols allow cooperation at a scale that used to belong only to empires. A scientist in one country can build on data published the day before in another. Families scattered across continents can see and hear one another with a tap of glass. People who grew up lonely with their interests can find others who understand. But it also has its own version of the old anxiety. When a phrase, an image, or an instruction can move everywhere at once, it can feel as if we are living inside a new kind of tower, one that is less brick and bitumen and more code and bandwidth. Trends swell and vanish before we have time to ask whether we want to be coordinated in that way. Speech can become strangely standardized, even when it is technically being produced by millions of different individuals. So the old questions return in a new key. How much unity do we actually want? How much sameness of language, of metaphor, of rhythm? How much do we gain by making our words interoperable? And what do we lose when every conversation starts to sound like every other? The Babel story does not tell us where to draw that line. It simply insists that there is a line, that there is such a thing as too much reach, too little friction, too complete a fusion of voice and power. It also suggests that scattering, however uncomfortable, can be gentler than it feels. To be pushed outward into different tongues and smaller circles is to be reminded that meaning is local as well as global, that there are jokes you can only tell in one language, that there are proverbs that only make sense in one landscape, that there are truths that must be spoken quietly, in the presence of people who know your particular history. You might think, lying in the dark or listening on a quiet commute, about the languages that hold your life, the one you dream in, the one you use for work, the one your grandparents still think in, even if your tongue stumbles over it, the slang that marks you as belonging to a particular time, city, or online community. Each of these is a small answer to Babel, a way of being connected without being entirely absorbed. And you might also think about the global languages you move through every day, whether that is English or another dominant tongue, or the shared vocabulary of the internet. Likes, shares, follows, streams. These are the dialects of our own empire of connection. We cannot, and probably would not want to, abandon them. But we can move through them with a slight awareness that they too have limits, and that those limits might be merciful. The tower on the plain of Shinar never received its final stone. Our own towers, of infrastructure, of communication, of shared discourse, are also, in their own way, unfinished. They will be revised, repurposed, and one day left behind for other forms. Between now and then, we live in the same tension that haunted the ancient cities, drawn toward one language that can reach everywhere, and drawn back toward the smaller, more intimate speech that makes us who we are. If this slow walk through Babel's mystery has kept you company, you're welcome to let that tension just rest for a while. Let the questions about unity and difference, empire and locality, sit half-built in your mind like the abandoned tower itself. You do not have to solve them tonight, or even ever. Living with them, hearing them from many angles in many voices, may be part of what it means to inherit this old story. As we drift to a close, I'd be glad to know where you are in this scattered world of ours. If you'd like, you can leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. One small way of turning the whole Earth into a gentle list of particular places and moments. And if this kind of quiet, curious history helps you rest or think, you can tap like, leave a comment, or subscribe so you don't miss the next mystery we explore together. Wherever you are, whatever language fills the room around you, may it be enough tonight. May it be a good place to end.